morning to present some information on the benefits of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I'll use interchangeably throughout the presentation with diversity and inclusion. And sometimes we talk about belonging, and we'll get into all of that a little bit later today. But really and truly, I just want you to come away with, a greater understanding of why diversity and inclusion is a great thing for the workplace and why it really is great for business. Of course, as a Chamber of Commerce, that's your primary concern. So I must say that I struggled with naming today's presentation, and I went back and forth around calling it the business case for diversity and inclusion, since of course it is a Chamber of Commerce, but I decided against it. And hopefully as I go through the presentation, you'll see why I moved away from that, and to talk really more about some of the amazing benefits of D&I work. So I always like to begin with a land acknowledgement and a recognition that we are settlers on this land. I am currently on the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among the Mississaugas peoples. We honor, recognize, and respect this nation and Indigenous peoples and the traditional stewards of the land on which we work, and we pay tribute to their legacy and the legacy of all First Peoples of Canada. We acknowledge that we are all treaty people, and we accept our responsibility to honor all our relations. For today, I'm going to cover 4 main topics. First, I'll begin by defining the terms diversity, equity, and inclusion, what it is and why we're doing it. Then we'll review what we mean when we talk about the business case for diversity and inclusion and what that has historically included. We'll talk about the current movement for social justice and why the conversation is actually shifting away from the traditional business case for diversity and inclusion. And then we'll talk about some systemic and structural workplace issues that need to be addressed to create a truly diverse and inclusive workplace. And then finally, I will talk to you about the implications for, of course, the Chamber of Commerce at this time of social justice, where racial equity is the topic of the day, and the ways in which this group can advance the diversity and inclusion conversation with the business community. At the end, we'll turn the cameras off, and I will answer any questions that you may have. I'll do a little bit of a safe space setting exercise there, and we'll proceed from there. Does that sound good to everyone? Perfect. So as I mentioned, we'll start off by just defining the concepts so that we're all on the same page in terms of what we're really speaking about, and it's really simple stuff. When we talk about diversity, we're talking about individual differences, just plain and simple. If you have different people in your workplace, you have diversity. So differences are truly a fact of life, and when we talk about it, we're literally talking about the condition of being composed of different elements. We all come from different backgrounds, and so we all have diverse identities. We tend to focus on equity-seeking groups and dimensions of diversity laid out in legislation like nationality, race, gender, age, sexual orientation, and ability. But there are so many more dimensions to diversity, and you can see some of those on this slide. You could probably pick something from each of those 3 boxes to identify yourself, and no 2 people within this room would have, for example, the same gender, sexual orientation, and whether or not they were in the military, for example, or your age or your ethnicity or your language. So we must be able to see diversity and recognize individual differences in order for us to really get to the conversation about inclusion. Diversity refers to the variety of similarities and differences among people, often called diversity dimensions. It includes, but it's not limited to, gender, sex, sexual orientation, expression, ethnicity, identity, origin, and even things like your belief systems, your marital status, your parental status. Are you pregnant? Are you not? Your socioeconomic status, your appearance. What? I'm so sorry. your work style, your job role, all those things add to the dimensions of diversity that we have. And so we can literally pick one or more dimensions to make the case that none of us truly are the same person. But diversity inclusion can't be just as simple as us recognizing that we're all unique and different, because scientists tell us that. We all know that we don't all have the same fingerprint, for example, that even twins don't have the same DNA. So we already know that there's no one like us. So what is really this larger conversation about? In the business context, it is about ensuring that your work environment includes a variety of people with different characteristics. It means avoiding employing the same types of people for the reasons that I will get into a little bit later on. Intersectionality is important to this conversation because no one has just one identity. The previous slide showed us that we are simultaneously members of multiple groups. And so the siloed approach to diversity usually focuses on only one aspect of difference. Intersectionality is coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. It's a framework for understanding how different aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create unique modes of discrimination and or privilege. So intersectionality identifies advantages and disadvantages that are felt by people due to this combination of factors. For example, you may be a gay man or a young mother, and what happens when you compound your age with your gender, or your ethnicity with your marital status, or your parental status, for example. You combine those intersectional identities, it creates additional advantages or disadvantages for you in society. Equity is about fairness and justice. It's about taking deliberate actions to remove systemic, group, or individual barriers and obstacles that hinder opportunities and disrupt well-being. It's achieved through the identification and elimination of policies and practices, attitudes, and cultural messages that create and reinforce unfair outcomes. The difference between equality and equity must be emphasized. Although both promote fairness, equality achieves this through treating everyone the same, regardless of their need or their circumstances. Equity achieves fairness through treating people differently depending on their specific needs, their specific circumstances, and consideration of other historical or systemic inequities. Inclusion is the act or state of being invited into a group or structure. It's a dynamic state of feeling, belonging, and operating in which diversity is leveraged and valued to create a fair, healthy, and high-performing organization or community. So an inclusive culture and environment ensure equitable access to resources and opportunities for all. It also enables individuals and groups to feel safe, to feel respected, to feel heard, engaged, and motivated for who they are. I see maybe something in the chat. Excuse me for just a second. Oh, that was great. I'm glad whoever said that, Andrew, that it was a great illustration. I'm glad you enjoyed that. So, for example, an exclusive workplace promotes dignity and respect for all employees and provides an environment where everyone can participate and work to their full potential. And people are understood, recognized, and supported for the unique value and values that they bring to a company. Where all dimensions of diversity are welcomed and their unique contributions are recognized, you have an inclusive environment. While people in organizations have personal preferences regarding certain names for the work that we do as practitioners in diversity and inclusion, there is really no one name that is generally better than another. So I use the terms diversity and inclusion, since equity is literally like in the name of my company, but it really covers the breadth of the depth of the work that I do. And other names are all emerging almost daily, right? So they're also gaining traction, but not all of them have broad global usage. So some names include diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, so DEIA, or IDEA, inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, or JEDI, justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. The term belonging is starting to become used a little bit more frequently as well. And so you might hear this body of work referred to by a variety of names, but ultimately the concepts are really interchangeable. And ultimately it's about understanding that each individual is unique, and that we must actively embrace individuality in everyone, regardless of their background, and equity that requires us to recognize and respect everyone's unique qualities. Diversity and inclusion is a company's mission, its strategies, its practices to support a diverse workplace and leverage the effects of diversity to achieve a competitive business advantage. Openness to diversity widens our access to the best talent. Inclusion allows us to engage that talent effectively. And then together, this leads to enhanced innovation, creativity, productivity, reputation, engagement, and results. It's why, everybody everywhere wants a diverse and inclusive workplace, because they've found this out. And I'll go through some of that data with you right now. So this is literally what we're talking about when we refer to the business case for diversity and inclusion. It really is about bringing together our top talent to deliver outstanding results. We've all heard about the benefits and pieces in articles like the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, or even non-governmental organizations like Oxfam. They've been championing diversity and inclusion for its business value. According to a recent study at BCG Henderson Institute, diverse companies report higher innovation revenue by 45%, whereas those with below average diversity scores report only a 26% innovation revenue. We've also heard, for example, from McKinsey & Company that improving women's economic inclusion could add $12 trillion or more to the global GDP. Businesses and organizations benefit from having the right people, reflecting Canada's full diversity and putting their talents to use. The leadership of corporate Canada and our major organizations should look like Canada, not simply because it's fair, but also because it makes good business sense. Time and time again, research has shown that businesses and organizations that embrace diversity on their boards and on their management teams, they outperform their peers. Intuitively, a broader range of perspectives and talents results in better performance. Embracing diversity and inclusion in the workplace is a good business decision for a multitude of reasons. The correlation between diversity and performance has been cited by the likes of McKinsey, Forbes, and the Harvard Business Review. McKinsey in particular reports that more diverse companies are better able to win top talent and improve their customer orientation, employee satisfaction, and decision-making. Ultimately, organizations with diverse teams, they outperform their competitors. Where efforts are increased to accelerate the representation of women, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and people of color, those organizations innovate better, they serve the public better, and you see greater profits. So it really drives cultural, economic, and social vitality and innovation. A diverse, equitable, and inclusive culture celebrates the differences that make a company stronger. And a workforce that represents an array of backgrounds and experiences helps create an environment that maximizes every employee's contribution. It widens the leadership pipeline and it enhances work, including the quality of a company's opinions, products, and services. The diversity and inclusion conversation tends to focus on the historically marginalized groups on the screen. The truth is that women, racialized persons, people who identify as LGBTQ, people living with disabilities, including invisible and episodic disabilities, as well as First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, they're all represented in positions of economic influence and organizational leadership, including on corporate boards and in senior management. According to StatsCan, 50% of the working population is now comprised of women between the ages of 15 and 64, while 1 in 7 Canadians age 15 and older report living with a disability. Racialized individuals comprise 22% of our population, and the Canadian Aboriginal population increased by more than 20% between 2006 and 2011, compared with 5.2% for the non-Aboriginal population. These pools of uniquely positioned talent are an asset to any organization which intends to thrive in the future of work. Canada has an imperative in the diversity and inclusion conversation. One thing that we know is that we have a very large number of people who are, of course, about to retire from the Canadian workforce and retiring daily. People are also not having as many babies in Canada. And so in order to increase our population, we need to bring in more immigrants to Canada to fuel our economy. It's just not sustainable from the Canadian born. The other piece that we know is that there are a lot of groups who are being underutilized in our workforce. We have youth or people under the age of 24 years old who have higher unemployment rates than the rest of the population. The same is true for Aboriginal people and people with disabilities and visible minorities. And so one of the ways to address the impending talent shortage is through diversity and inclusion. It's through getting the full participation of everybody who wants to work to actually work in our workforce. As I noted, our population is certainly changing and aging. 7 million more Canadians are here over the past 2 decades. By the year 2069, we anticipate having 55.2 million people in Canada. 1/3 of the population in 2016 was estimated to be people of color. That estimate will be about 1/3 of the population in 2036. Which means that immigration obviously is going to be a key driver of that population growth, representing about 24.5 to 30% of the total population. Indigenous peoples contribute billions of dollars to our economy annually, and they're creating new businesses at 5 times the rate of non-Indigenous peoples. When combined with the fact that Indigenous peoples are the youngest, fastest growing demographic in Canada, we can ensure that they have the same opportunities to contribute to our economy. It truly is an economic imperative. As you can see on the slide, women make up over 70% of all household spending decisions in Canada. Visible minorities are 19.1%, with a spending power of over $67 billion. I mentioned Indigenous people own more than 10,000 businesses with spending power of over 24 billion, and LGBTQ communities have spending power of over $100 billion. People with disabilities, 73% of them are the head of their household. And so that tells you that they're making the financial decisions. And this is all, again, more of the reasons why the business case for diversity and inclusion is so strong. So workplace diversity is no longer a good thing to do. It truly has become a business necessity. And the most purpose-driven companies recognize that diversity and inclusion should be an integral part of the way in which they do business. Even still, we're moving away from the business case for diversity and inclusion. Previously, we were convincing corporations that DEI was good because it was profitable, and it is when it's done well. And however, the business case has done nothing to truly change the rates of hiring discrimination across North America. Now, DEI leaders have discovered that we need to teach corporate leaders to stop trying to justify diversity with profit margins and instead embrace diversity and inclusion as the right thing to do and to see the social imperative for this as well. So it's why I went back and forth and decided against naming this presentation exclusively about the business case for diversity and inclusion. Despite this being a Chamber of Commerce, I really wanted to give you the cutting edge information. And the truth is that people are totally moving away from having to present a business case for doing what is morally just the right thing to do. We ought to want to create a more inclusive and equitable society in which everyone thrives and participates. And so the conversation around the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion has been shifting. And that's because we don't actually see a diverse, inclusive, and equitable society. We actually see something more similar to what's on the screen here. And so the assumption is that the obsession with the business case logic, it really just hasn't been working. When we look at the Global Gender Gap Report by the World Economic Forum or the recent Power Gap Report by the Globe and Mail, we realize that we will not reach gender parity for over 50 years in Europe and between 100 and 150 years in North America. And we are even further behind on achieving racial equality. The business case for diversity can actually hurt those that we're making the case for. So women and racial minorities who are the supposed beneficiaries of the business case for diversity may actually experience negative consequences if we solely focus on the business case. The latest experiments have found that exposure to an organization's business case for diversity decreased a sense of belonging to that organization for women and members of the LGBTQ community. which was then associated with a lower desire to join the organization and lower performance on the job. The business case language, it has a way of making people feel othered and devalued, right? We're just contributing for the economic benefit of a company, which truly makes people feel not so great. A 2019 study by Catalyst in association with Ascend Canada, they developed Pan-Asian talent. They found that Canadian people of color carry an extra weight at work that is so significant that it impacts their health and causes them to contemplate quitting their jobs. This weight is known as an emotional tax and a feeling of being different from their peers at work because of gender or race or ethnicity, which can affect a person's well-being and their ability to thrive in their job. The study reported that people of color often try to downplay aspects of their identity in order to shield themselves from bias. And some said that they avoid wearing certain cultural clothing, or they actually make efforts to temper their language or try to appear older than they are to counter this emotional tax. And so this burden and this impact of this emotional tax can be double or triple for women who are Indigenous, who identify as LGBTQ, or if they have disabilities. It's just compounded again with that intersectional lens by being both a woman as well as a person with one or more of these differentiated identities. On top of the tax, they often face hiring biases, a lower wage gap, a greater wage gap, lower levels of employment, and less representation in leadership and executive positions. Between 33 and 50% of the study's subjects, they reported feeling on guard against potential workplace bias, and 50 to 69% said it produced a high intent to quit. Another 22 to 42% of the people surveyed also reported sleep problems. As I noted, decades of research on the impact of diversity, demographics, experience, communication styles, et cetera, on organizations, it generally suggests that organizations with more diversity outperform the less diverse organizations on the basis of profit, employee engagement, productivity, and creativity. But taking a deeper look, it also reveals other more complex conclusions from this body of work. For example, introducing diversity to formerly homogeneous teams lowers cohesiveness and increases conflict. In the organizational context and culture, it better explains organizational success than race or gender diversity actually do. And only mature teams, not young or immature teams, benefit from diversity. So this isn't to say that there is no business case for diversity, but it does mean that the mechanisms by which diversity creates value are far more complicated than what people actually understand. It's not just a matter of, finding a bunch of diverse candidates and throwing them into your applicant pool or into your organization. It's a nuanced thing, and that's why diversity and inclusion work is so difficult, because you can try to diversify, but still create a whole host of additional challenges. So DEI practitioners are discussing how the business case for diversity is a sinking ship. Obtaining any lasting benefit from diversity requires not just the presence of a diverse workforce, but also effective leadership that can manage conflict, create cultures of inclusiveness, characterized, of course, by psychological safety and growth mindsets. And they also have to make organizational change where needed to support a diverse workforce. So in other words, the business case for diversity only appears after hard work to transform its many costs into benefits, hard work that very few companies are actually willing to do. Articles are popping up almost daily discussing how workplaces and executive boardrooms should reflect the world's diversity, and that the so-called business case for diversity to instigate action is actually a failed strategy. For example, there are no Black C-suite executives in some of the largest companies in Canada. What's required for transformational action is both a moral and a legal one. So the business case, because it's based on economic logic, it undermines the moral arguments, and it weakens our resolve to make anything other than very small incremental changes. So indeed, experiments show that making the business case for diversity can increase bias against diverse groups, while the legal case can inhibit bias and increase equitable behavior. The business case for diversity also provokes people to focus more on economic rather than equality-based metrics for success. As a consequence, where there are downturns in an organization's performance, believers in the business case are more likely to see diversity efforts as ineffective and to support dropping the organization's investment in diversity programs. And so we've undergone a bit of a framing shift from protecting communities from discrimination and harassment based on human rights grounds to actually benefiting corporations by diversity and inclusion. D&I work with the business case does not center the outcomes relevant to marginalized communities, for example, health and access to opportunities and wealth and education, but instead it centers outcomes that are relevant to corporations like revenue and innovation and community relations. As a result, corporations have made billions from diversity, equity, and inclusion without substantially raising up the communities that they actually benefit from. So there's this moral push-pull that's taking place. Relying on the business case to motivate the kinds of transformations that we need to achieve social and economic inclusion will only lead to very small incremental changes. So we need instead to truly set quotas and return to affirmative action programs, or said differently, eliminate the current systems that unfairly advantage dominant groups, and then transform work practices to make all kinds of people feel like they can do their best work. This is really the only way that we're gonna truly achieve, a level playing field. So what are the implications for the Whitby Chamber of Commerce? As the conversation shifts from the business case for diversity and inclusion to one of a moral imperative in the post-George Floyd era, we recognize that we all have a responsibility to do better and to build a more just society that serves everyone equally. And of course, racial equity has become an increasingly important topic of conversation, which is a focused effort to address racial disparities in the workplace. So there are many things that you can do to promote not only the business case for diversity and inclusion, but social justice for business as well. So you can offer internships and employment opportunities to individuals, advance ethnically diverse candidates within your organization or outside in the communities, promote cultural awareness through initiatives and activities that you are part of, have courageous conversations internally as well as with your external partners, engage with organizations that are dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and empower diverse employees to truly reach their full potential, again, both internally and externally, and have education seminars about racial justice, foster inclusive work environments where all views matter. Racial equity also makes good business sense. Whoop. You can commit to achieving equity and enable employers to take a systematic results-oriented approach toward achieving equity by creating a comprehensive plan to accelerate representation across your business, as well as other businesses in the community, and create new and innovative ways to invest in and contribute to racial justice efforts in other businesses as well. Creating specialized groups to develop and empower certain businesses through networking, educational and leadership opportunities in an effort to support their businesses and connect with allies. Now is also the moment to begin rebuilding positive, respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. While there's still much work to do and progress to be made, the past decade has seen a significant increase in the attention paid to reconciliation by governments, businesses, educators, and cultural institutions, media. Seminal reports from this period underscore the urgency of improving relations and advancing toward reconciliation. Both reports that I'll tell you about provide valuable information and direction to help you adopt a commitment to reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and play a leadership role. Those reports are UNDRIP, which stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This was adopted by the UN in 2007, and it enshrines and protects individual and collective rights that constitute the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples all over the world. These rights include enjoyment of Indigenous cultures, customs, and languages, and strengthening of their economies through social and political institutions. In 2015, in Canada, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued its call to action report, which includes 94 calls to action to redress the legacy of residential schools and to advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. And so these actions fall under a range of issues and categories and are directed to different organizations and institutions, including the business community. So this chamber can implement a few of those actions in the report, like learning about the history of the land, sharing this information with your employees and the business community, engaging with Indigenous people and committing to meaningful consultation with them whenever you're developing something, building respectful relationships and obtaining the free prior informed consent of Indigenous peoples before proceeding with economic development projects. And then provide education for your management and your staff on the history of the peoples, including the history and legacy of the residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, their treaties, their Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, and Aboriginal Crown relations. This requires skills-based training, intercultural competency, cultural conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. So you can ensure that Indigenous people have equitable access to jobs, to training and education in your business and in the sector, and that Indigenous communities both on and off reserve gain long-term sustainable benefits from economic development projects. People with disabilities, they will choose a business where they feel welcomed and where they can easily get the products and services that they want. And so businesses can do well to attract more customers, employees, by removing as many barriers to access as possible, making Ontario open for business and open for jobs for everyone. They are largely overlooked as a talent pool. Many of top talents are people with disabilities, and they help fill important vacancies. So building and maintaining an inclusive workplace will create a more supportive environment for Whitby Chamber employees as well. And having a diverse workforce that reflects the town's residents ultimately helps it provide better service to the community. Businesses, chambers, and boards of trade across Canada can be early adopters of even the Rick Hansen Foundation Accessibility Certification Program and be leaders in helping to build a more accessible Canada. The Whitby Chamber is also encouraged to champion mentally healthy workplaces and encourage their members to adopt the national standards for psychological health and safety in the workplace. A mentally healthy workplace can foster a positive culture, promote employees' mental well-being, and prevent harm to employee mental health, and truly support people with mental health problems and illnesses. Advocate for organizations to place women in leadership and create a more diverse talent pipeline, have equal pay and gender pay parity within your organizations, and encourage it externally, and create inclusive cultures for women, which includes working mothers and the provision of benefits and paid parental leaves. And of course, sexual harassment policies to prevent harassment and discrimination. We of course have to truly just embrace diversity, right? Whenever you're having conversations, figure who is in the room, who isn't in the room, and factor those diversity into your decisions when making layoffs, decisions, furloughs, and return to work decisions, and encourage, of course, the business community to do so as well. You can organize a task force, I believe you've already done so, to include employees at all levels, to address issues of diversity and inclusion within your workplace, and then look for and build the diverse pools of candidates. And then turn the lens on yourself, examine your company practices. A lack of objectivity in corporate practices can create cracks in your company's structure. So go through the different practices in your organization that you've adopted and evaluate whether you need some sort of rubrics or scorecards when assessing job prospects, as well as during a performance evaluation. Examine the knowledge, skills, and abilities required for different roles, and then adjust degree and certification requirements to truly match the requirements for the jobs. In some cases, certain criteria might unintentionally filter out different populations of job candidates. So determine and reevaluate the degree requirements and consider hiring based on job-specific related abilities rather than hiring solely based on degrees and certifications. You can create a diversity strategy so that focuses on hiring diverse candidates and elevating non-traditional employees to leadership positions. Prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion to enrich your offerings to your many stakeholders. Ensure you can recruit and retain the best talent, empower women, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus communities and racialized peoples, and implement comprehensive education programs such as diversity trainings and specialized training programs for historically marginalized groups. You can create business resource groups, from within the community that can address issues for specific historically marginalized businesses. Institute DE&I accountability measures, and acknowledge the opportunity for the Whitby Chamber to do more in promoting a diverse and inclusive workplace and community culture, and recognize the responsibility that you have to your employees, your stakeholders, and to society to advance your own diversity strategy. You can ensure an inclusive workplace from an employee and operational perspective, offer diversity trainings and supplier diversity programs. For example, require training for all employees with specialized training focused on inclusive leadership and how to be inclusive leaders. Commit to using minority, women, veteran, LGBTQ-owned businesses, which have historically been underutilized in the supply chain, and encourage others to do so as well. Review your systems to determine if structural issues present any barriers for historically marginalized groups, and encourage other businesses in the community to do so as well. These are all the unfair policies, the differences in opportunities, and inequitable treatment that allow bias to persist in organizations. So find out, is there structural racism, sexism, ageism, ableism, et cetera, within the workplace, right? And then once you determine that, right, how do those structural issues manifest? How can we minimize the racism, the sexism, the ageism? Which systems perpetuate those inequities, and how do we eliminate them? Is there a power gap? Are we, do we have gender parity? And does the leadership reflect the population? So it's not nearly enough to have conversations about diversity and inclusion and what the business case is. The conversation is increasingly being recognized as being ineffective. We must review our systems to evaluate the inequities in our structures and address them in order to achieve inclusive and equitable workplaces. Diversity, equity, and inclusion today has evolved from the conversation about equality and the business case for diversity and inclusion to a conversation about providing people with custom tools that address inequality and are actually fixing our systems at their roots to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities, as demonstrated in the image on the slide. We've moved and continue to move from conversations about diversity and inclusion to conversations about equity and oppressive systems, and how to break barriers and how to truly fix our systems to achieve justice for everyone. With diversity and inclusion, we are ultimately striving for a world in which people can participate without the need for accommodation or supports, because the barrier that was in the way no longer exists. The Chamber plays an important role in promoting local business activity and representing Chamber members. You shape policy that relates to the business and overall economic environment, and the mutual protection and promotion of business interests. You guys can certainly band together and come up with ways to market your products and services in a way that really does promote this social, the social justice for business model, and form a collective to address important concerns and issues for the business community. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce notes that it's important to build relationships with groups that are often underrepresented in business, and not only the right thing to do, but notes that it's also critical to our national competitiveness and well-being. Our initiatives locally in Whitby are important contributors to the national conversation on competition. And you can help organizations move forward in a way that meets the competitive priorities of business while respecting the rights of historically marginalized groups. And I thank you for your time. So perhaps now we can turn the cameras off and I can answer any questions that you might have.